Aloha everybody, welcome to this edition of Get Quick Get Sick. I'm your host Cryptochronica, and today we're going to be doing a walkthrough of my new upcoming track WYLD, which I hope you will all pre-save, like, share, listen, and follow when it drops. It'll be coming out December 3rd, and I am quite excited for it. It's 8 months in the making and has had lots and lots and lots of rounds of feedback. So before we dive into the track and take a look at some of the processing and compositional goodies, we're going to go ahead and just play it through so that we know what we're talking about today. All right, away we go.
Well, survival is for survival, you know, in this time, especially going through so much struggle. And survival is a reality, for we have to survive.
Sweet! Thank you so much for listening and for joining me for this little walkthrough of my new upcoming track, WYLD. Today we're going to get into how some of these ideas were created and then how they were processed in order to make them feel big and wide and loud, which are some of the objectives that I'm always searching for in my own music. Now, the first thing is the idea of this song of getting wild is not particularly original, and WYLD is pretty much the most basic bitch status way of even naming something wild, but I saw it on a sample pack and I was just like, you know what, I gotta name it that. And then I found a really good friend of mine, vtizzel, or actually I was recommended from a good friend of mine, someone he works with, this guy vtizzel, who's a fantastic rapper, and he recorded a couple of very basic ad-libs and stuff for me, basically about getting wild, and damn, that shit is wild, and sweet, this shit is wild. And he provided me a self-made sample pack that I was able to draw resources from throughout the entire track. So if you know friends who have good vocals and are comfortable in front of a microphone, let them go crazy. Have them come over for an hour, give them some weed or give them some money or something and be like, yo, just go ahead and start talking into the mic in that sultry, sexy, harmonically rich voice that you have. They can say things like, get your hands up and let me see you drop, and all those really, really cliche EDM one-liners that really go a long way in making a track come to life and to feel variable. Fortunately for me, V's actually a rapper who can come up with pretty sweet little lyrics, and so we were able to get him to do a verse that has to do with turning up the groove. Oh, that's not it. Let's see if we can find it here. So, by delaying out and reverbing out one simple line and talking about turning up the groove, I was able to use this one bit of audio and get more mileage out of it by stretching it out over a long period of time. So once you find a sentence or a lyric that has the overall attitude of the entire song in it, that signature essential sentence, and in this case it's damn that shit is wild and I just want the groove loud. Once you find those signature vocal sentences, really use them a bunch that you're bearing down into the memory of the listener and just kind of forcing them through rote repetition to memorize the face and the essence of your song. So I've used that lyric quite a bit all over this place, and I was trying to get as deep with the processing as I could, in that I would use little bits of the vocal with scratch tracks on them. Oh, actually, this is an example of using it with a Spectrum Resonator. Spectral Resonator on vocals is very cool, especially when you have the Spectral Resonator take input from the sub line, so that way the vocal is playing the note that the sub is playing, or from an arpeggio or something like that. It can be very, very cool. You might be wondering, why is it all so quiet? Well, I don't have my mastering chain on or my processing chains. We're going to turn them on together. I worry that OBS is going to flip a switch and totally shut down when I turn all that stuff on. Will go to about 300% CPU. So we're not going to worry about that too much. Now, in bass music, of course, the bass is super, super important, but you can't make a good bass without having a very, very careful sub. So what we can see is I designed my sub MIDI notes up here first in just empty MIDI clips, and then kind of once I knew the way the bass would move, I drew the waveform by resampling, by taking the note that it was playing and resampling it into a resample window. And that way you can create perfectly sized 808s or perfectly sized bass shapes because you resample it. And I will normally resample a bass like a long chunk of audio like this, and then I will draw into this long resampled bit of bass volume automation using a utility. This is a very tedious process, but it's almost like using amplitude envelope on a long stretch of bass sound, and you can get really, really precise once you've already bounced the bass out. So maybe I want to create a bass shape that looks like this little teardrop. Well, that is essentially this kind of shape, and then I would probably put a little bit of a tail on it like that. So I will very regularly just record a long stretch of fully open volume modulation or amplitude modulation on a sound, and then I'll come back in and very carefully sculpt it by drawing in the volume or the filter movements with automation. And this way you can get a really, really controlled kind of sound. Now, I was also going off of this kind of layout for the bass sound that I really liked, but I added my own hits and I added a lot of my own pitch modulations and movement to it. So, a lot of diving. Again, you don't hear too much from it. Here's the Ilgate's Bobo Moog sub pack from the Producer Dojo. Definitely get your hands on this because this is a really, really painstakingly curated analog sampler, or excuse me, analog Moog that has been thrown into a sampler, and everything about it is very resonant and full and rich, and you can see there are all kinds of different careful automations and modulations that are being tied to the wobble, the shape, the movement, the gain, and I pretty much drew in that modulation. Let's go ahead and hop over to the drums, because there are some things that are really worth pointing out about the drums. Let's listen for a second and I'll show you exactly where they are when the new bass comes in. Let's go from right here. Actually, let's check out the false drop. So into our build, we go into the downbeat right here, but I have put a half bar extension just to squeeze even extra tension out of this, because sometimes when you go straight from a build into a drop, it doesn't quite land as right as it could, as if you had your band take a pause and go 1 2 1 2 3 4. That's essentially what I was doing here. Let's go ahead and check it out now. Without that kind of count down and count in, it would just feel a little bit too rushed getting into the main meat of the sound. So I really wanted to emphasize that and give us that kind of count. Of course, it's counting in 16th notes, so it feels a lot faster. This is multi-layered. That's the basic perk sound with a little bit of, oh, I guess I've frozen in the audio, but I cut out the lows and I swept it down with an EQ, and then the top layer is a metallicized version of this original sound. I basically duplicated it and then downsampled it and put a little bit of corpus on it to resonate out the frequencies and create this higher layer, which has a slightly different profile. Anytime you downsample things using your trusted Redux, you can get these really cool kinds of colors that are a little bit metallic out of a sound, and I really recommend using this as a parallel layer. So it's 100% wet, because here's our dry signal, here's the parallel layer. If we check it out, you can do this kind of thing. Oh, well, maybe not that exaggerated. Kind of like in there, right before about 4,000 is before it sounds a little bit too poopy. It does get to be a bit poopy sometimes when you go into the very, very low lows. So that was that little section. We just need to squeeze the extra transition out of that. And then in the drop itself, I want to point out the variations in rhythmic focus, because if you listen to the whole section, you're going to hear, like a lot of trap music, occasional switches into triplets in the bass. Let's listen for that, and I'll point out when it happens. Let's even turn on the drum processing. There it is. Much broader snare. New bass is about to come in that's triplet. Cool, so you can hear that this bass is not moving on grid the way the others are. It's actually playing triplet divisions. And if I switch to triplets by hitting Command 3, we'll be able to see that these are playing 16th notes, or pardon me, 8th note triplet divisions, which is really cool. But for whatever reason, triplets don't work too well with drums that have not switched into triplets. So in the moments that this bass comes in, what I've had to do is I've had to change the idea, not the offbeat so much, which is kind of just playing on the offbeat, but the main downbeat hat patterns, that tick, 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 tick. All of those have had to switch to triplets so that they play the transient of the bass with the bass in unison. Otherwise, it gets to be a bit messy, and your ear can get kind of disturbed by all the untripleted transients. So if I just had this crash sound carrying out with our bass here, it's going to not sound as good as it could. You hear how it's like whoop, 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 whoop. It's just not really playing with the crash. So instead what I have done, I've switched to triplet mode and I've copied out the crash pattern, but at a triplet division. So it's doing the same thing as the crash, just in triplets. And what this does is it essentially makes it seem like my bass player and my drummer are having eye sex on stage. They're looking at each other and they're like, yo, you about to switch to triplets? And he's like, roger that, brada. And then the two of them are playing in triplets together. They're working together in a term that we call in music prosody. Prosody is this idea where everything from the drums and the sub design go into supporting one central theme at a given time. And in this particular context, this time signature that is really important is triplets. So that's one aspect of the prosody that we have to maintain, as well as this particular bass sound that was made. Just wasn't cool outside of triplets. It had to be a triplet bass. So we made it that way, and then I had to fit all the other elements of the music to work around that particular thing. Cool. Let's go ahead and take a little bit of a look at the drum process here, because a lot of this, it matters, you know. Getting the drums to sound good is the thing that's going to drive the groove and the grid of your track, or the back and forth motion of your track. So what we've done in here is the slightest amount of EQing, and these days I probably wouldn't even do a low-cut EQ off my kicks anymore. I think it ruins the sound of the kick and can kind of smear some of the transient in ways that are no longer desirable, but this was done in October, and as such, it's old news, and what they say is old news is fake news. So I'm not going to be changing things that I can't do anything about. The track is already released. But thereafter, I'm following the drum processing with a touch of tape saturation. Nowadays, I will often hit it with a little bit of stage 2 saturation as well. Then we have some solid state logic bus compression in parallel, and this is going to be hitting about 8 to 10 dB of makeup gain here, or 8 to 10 decibels of gain reduction. So before we put this on, here's the drums. Not bad by any means. But after being activated, we're able to get a little bit of a lift out of our high end. That's coming from the energy that the saturation is providing. It's making things sparklier, a little bit more bright, a little bit more interesting. And then it's also becoming a little bit more consistent in dynamic difference. And that's all coming from the compression that we've used in parallel and brought up behind the dry signal to supplement that space in between the transients of the main drum hits. Thereafter, we have just a bit of widening in the very tippy top high end. I like it when my drums are kind of mono and then splits off at the top up there, so that in that 10,000 and above range, or here I guess it's 7,000, they're kind of wrapped around the stereo field as you would do in drum and bass. Very regular technique there. And then thereafter, we have a little bit of macro energy shaping, which is basically moments to pull down the track 1.8 decibel or to narrow it periodically from moment to moment, but not a lot. And that's because dry drums tend to sound a lot better than if you're doing too many processes to drums and you're smearing transients or chorusing drums or reverbing drums and you're kind of ruining the signal. A lot of these samples that we're using are coming from sound designers like Cymatics, Leviathan, Origin Sound, whatever it is that you're shopping for your samples. A lot of those samples are made in like virtual sound labs. They're perfect. There is no mud. There are really high fidelity transients, really, really clear, punchy mixes. You don't need to do a lot to these drag and drop ready samples. And in fact, by doing things to them, compressing them, EQing them, or goodness gracious forbid, reverbing them, you can kind of really fuck the sample up and make it sound kind of smeary and low fidelity. So I'm very careful with my drums these days, and dry tends to go a lot further, and that will stand true until we come to our discussion of ambience kind of at the end today, and I do use ambience on my drums. Anyway, you've seen the sub, you've seen the drums. Let's go ahead and double check the basses, everybody's favorite thing to see. And let's take a little bit of a look at our bass processing chain. None of this is on. That is bass number 5. There we go. So hotkey 5 is going to turn on my bass processing chain. Let's just listen to it at first before we get into the chain. Yeah, cool. Let's listen to the basses first here. Now, the checkerboard is not super delineated. Very often, when I am coming up with a bass line, what I will do is I will design a checkerboard from an empty MIDI clip first. From this perspective first. I will come in here and I'll be like, this is where bass 1's going to be, and that one's going to go whoa, 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 whoa. And I'll do it with my mouth and with my imagination. And then we'll take the whole idea, and the second bass line is going to be here, and that one's going to be womp, womp. And then the last one is going to be right here, and that's going to be a really cool big fill, and I color fills black. And then iteration 2, here's the idea, you duplicate it over, and there's going to be a variation in iteration 2. Perhaps our variation is now this one is not going whoa, 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 whoa. Maybe it's going woo, 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 woo. So I would put that in with a different MIDI marked checkerboard, and I might even color this to be a zoom bass. So it gets really silly really fast, especially when your parents are in the other room and you're in here talking to yourself and making weird noises like you belong in a preschool. Nothing against preschoolers. But that said, designing a checkerboard first in just empty MIDI clips like this and letting your imagination in your mouth work to fill in the space is infinitely faster than trying to sound design a drop from scratch. So once I have a checkerboard pattern that I like, I will come in and I will fill in the different pieces. Legato this across, and I know that this purple checker has to go here. This blue checker might also be the same note, but it might be a different timbre or a different voice. So I want to indicate that on the checker itself, so that way I know that this needs some kind of variation. So after you find yourself a nice checkerboard that you've designed in MIDI clips, then you fill in the sounds themselves. This is why it's extremely helpful to have your sounds already built and put into a robust user library that you can quickly pull new ideas from. I could go to my instruments, and then I could go to my instrument rack, and as you can see, I have lots of unique to Cryptochronica's style basses that I have made in other sessions, whether waiting for an airplane or trying to check into a hotel. You know, when I'm having just a couple of minutes of music that I can do, that's when I will do my sound design. So that way, when it comes to composition, I'm not wasting any of my time composing, sound designing in the composition. So let's go ahead and check out the basses here and see if there is any sound design stuff worth bringing out. Yeah, very basic bass here. Bringing down the lows a little bit, cleaning up that one fundamental, which was very muddy, problematic. Little bit of dip in the mids, because mid frequencies kind of bother my ear sometimes. Let's turn on our processing and see what's going on over here. Cool, this is a cool trick, definitely worth sharing. So the whole bass group, this is the difference between it dry, processed, run through the Skrillex bus, I just turned that on, and now mastered. Oh yeah, we can't do the mastering. Okay, never mind. You're gonna have to just imagine the basses with the mastering chain on. Anyway, it is what it is. The first thing that I've done in here on the entire group, after getting everything leveled, let's cover that because that is really important. So it's very helpful to have what's called an illustration window or a resampling window. At the bottom of your track, I usually color this white because it's to denote that it is somehow more intentional or important. And it can be really useful to record your groups out group by group to kind of get your eyes on things. And that way you can see where the balance is instead of just relying on your ear. So if I solo my bass line here, or my bass group, which has been soloed, and I record it out, we're going to see that most of these waveforms are very carefully balanced with one another. I'm able to see where there's dynamics, and I'm able to see what might need a little bit more group compression or a little bit more of a squeeze. But for the most part, I am not seeing waveforms that look like this bullshit. I'm not seeing this. That would tell me that I need to rebalance, re-level that bass itself. And so I can very quickly get a visual reference on things by using this illustration window. And the reason I name it illustration window is because after recording and recording and recording lots of chunks of your track, you get a bunch of gigabytes of nonsense onto your computer. So after I'm done with the project, I'll go to my computer's browser and I'll type in illest, and anything that says illest, I delete. So that way I'm not storing a ton of nonsense onto the computer. Just a nice little visual trick. So that's what the bass looks like. Now, the next thing that I have turned on after getting everything leveled, I did a little bit of super delicate tape saturation. Again, a tape saturator is a common staple of most music studios, and you really can't go wrong with this gentle, warming kind of effect. Now, the next type of saturation is a little bit more interesting and probably something some of you may have not seen before. I have a dry chain here in the parallel rack, and thereafter I have a super distorted instance of trash using the buzzsaw with some of my own adjustments, which sounds like this at full volume. Very folded, very metallic. Let's check another bass. Oh, let's check another one. Goodness gracious. And very like MIDI and kind of like gray and tonal. And so what I've done is I have my dry signal here, and I have taken this extremely distorted sound without the EQ. It's going to blow your ears out. So just very, very distorted. And I've shaved out most of the highs and most of the lows. And oh, whoops, I didn't even solo it. Let's check that out again. Very distorted, right? Sounds like you're thrashing an electric guitar here. And I cut out all the high fidelity stuff and I cut out all the low end. So it's just kind of like the middle tone. And that tone I listened to with my dry signal, pulled it all the way down and brought it up slowly until I found a happy balance, which was about 25. And so what I'm doing is I'm creating this distortion layer that's common across all of the basses and slowly bringing it up to taste, using my ears as I listen, to the point that I hear it engage with the dry signal. And what this does is it provides a nice kind of duplicate layer. Oh, it looks like I even cut out the mid signal. Cool, I guess. I cut out the mid signal? What the heck? Or did I cut out the side signal? No, I cut out the mid signal. Okay, cool. So I cut out the mid, so it's just in the stereo spread, and the mono signal is the dry one only. So it's providing a little bit of a common color in just the stereo spread across all of the basses that play in the entire bass group, which is going to lend them not only the extra power of the distortion itself, but an extra sense, like a feather brush of similitude. They're all going to sound slightly similar together because they have the same very quiet, very subtle, and very MIDI distortion layer blended in ever so subtly. Let's see if we can perceive the difference. It's the difference between this and this. Kind of hard to hear without the mastering chain, and it also sounds like my shit is really, really turned down, but that's because I don't want to be blowing out your ears. So hopefully the balance between the vocal and the basses is okay. Cool, so that was the next thing, and I love doing this. Now, you could go to town with this kind of technique. This could be just one idea. We could have just one sort of isotope trashed distortion chain in here. Or I could go really deep with it. I could duplicate this yet again. And then I could come in here and I could change the profile of our EQ so that way it is something different in tone. Maybe we emphasize the highs and we de-emphasize the lows. Maybe we cut out that stuff with the middle that we're doing, which is sure to cause phase offset. Maybe it's a little bit different, a little louder, and maybe it's a different type of distortion algorithm. Then I could do that yet again a couple more times. And if I was going to do this a couple more times, I might want to pan them far left and far right and give each signal in the far left and far right a different type of chorus. And then I would be creating all of this crazy wide width between these three different extra signals because you have the Haas effect between the different choruses, as well as slightly different distortion algorithms, and then your dry signal chopping down the middle. So this distortion layering rack is very, very common in making dubstep and bass music, and how you choose to set this up and finesse it is going to have a really big signature on your style. When you're developing your style, the kinds of racks that you come back to and use regularly so that they become a through theme in all of the music that you create is going to really help the listener associate your production and your mixing with your style. And it's going to help people recognize immediately, even if they've never heard that track before. They're going to be like, oh, that's a Cryptochronica track. It's got that thing that he does that I hear, or not. But that's how I imagine my fans talk. Totally, totally kidding, my fans. I love you all so much. Sweet. Thereafter that trash saturation, we've got a little bit of widening. Now, I don't advise the Serum Effects. If you can, I really recommend getting Sound Toys. By far my preferred analog sort of choruses and delays and reverbs. I guess my preferred reverb is Valhalla. Shout outs to Valhalla DSP. That said, I didn't have any of that stuff on this computer when I was doing it. All of that had been torrented. Don't tell anyone. I bought it all now. Sorry, companies. I promise not to steal music in the future. Anyway, so at the time that I was composing this last October, all I had was Serum Effects. And what I've done here is I've done this in parallel. A lot of you would know at this point that I really, really despise dry wet knobs. Dry wet knobs are going to here, let's do it like this. They're going to crossfade between the dry signal and the wet signal. And as you turn up the wet signal, you turn down the dry signal. And that is going to give you some kinds of like it's just going to turn down the signal. It's going to turn down the volume. Whereas if you do things in parallel, in a parallel processing chain, you're always going to have your dry signal 100% dry. And then if I choose to bring up this 100% wet chorus next to it, I'm adding. It's just an additive growth. I'm always keeping the dry signal, but then the chorus that I layer up to widen it out and smear it a little bit isn't going to interfere with the dry signal. I'm not turning that down. I'm just adding the width because it's an additive process. So this will always give you more precise and more useful effects is when you do them in parallel. And so what I've done is in the Serum Effects, it's 100% wet, and I brought it in slowly to -18 decibels, listening as I did. The stereo widener is coming from our dimension expander, also 100% wet. And pro tip, or at least AU5 tip, use this thing with the size small. It tends to sound a lot better. And then just a tippy taste of reverb. Also, the lows are kind of cut here. I would probably cut a little bit softer or use the Fab Filter stuff these days. And then I would also, I sidechained the reverb signal to the dry signal itself. So that way, every time the dry is playing, the reverb dips out of the way. And when the dry signal stops, it swells to fill in that open space thereafter. Cool. Moving right along. Hopefully this is interesting to some of you, and it's not just me talking to myself, as is so often the case. Just ask my cats. They're like, bro, you're not talking to me. Why are you talking to yourself? Anyway, the next thing is the music group. There is nothing special about this, friends, except for the intro. Let's actually go pay attention to the intro. I found this fan-frickin-tastic pluck sound. Such a rich transient. Or this is technically the sound, I believe. Oh no, that's a different variation of it. Here's the sound it looks like. I found this really, really nice pluck sound and really tried to get a lot of mileage out of it. This CDG Sine Bliss, Synth Bliss thing. Very, very cool sound. And I basically played all sorts of different variations of octaves and then granulated it and did a lot of stretching. And to granulate a sound like this, you can get a lot of really cool texture out of an acoustic sample when you throw it into the granulator by Robert Henke, which is what I did here. There's a little bit of reverb on it, but this is very, very dry. And just by slowly pitching up the granulator and down the granulator, you get this really haunted kind of siren-y sort of acoustic, like you're stretching strings and shrinking strings. And it was really, really a fruitful kind of endeavor. So granulating sounds goes a long way. And then I found the main basic face melody. Now, when it comes to writing face melodies in trap music, at the very least, what is our key? D sharp minor. In trap music, what you will see all the time is this flirtation with notes that are slightly, this doesn't look like D sharp minor, but I guess it is because one of the notes is wrong. But in trap music, when you play two notes that are right next to each other, like E and D sharp, and the E's not in key here, because you're playing two notes that are right next to each other on a keyboard, they tend to take on a slightly dissonant characteristic. And dissonance is a fantastic way of squeezing tension. When things are dissonant, we associate them with being spooky or kind of intimidating or kind of uncomfortable. And so a lot of trap makes really good use of that kind of thing. So I was purposefully picking wrong notes in here in order to get this kind of dissonant but still kind of tense skeleton for my lead here. Cool, and then you can hear that I glided down the time. Lots of little glides and slides in my music because that emulates a guitarist sliding down the string of the guitar. Anytime that you can work glide into your track, I recommend it. Pitch bending as well, though they are, in theory, the same thing. In this case, my glide time is just set to 102 milliseconds. These days, my friends, these days, I unite my gliding with the BPM of my track. So the way that I would do that, if I wanted this section of sound to glide at an eighth note triplet, let's get out of triplets, let's just do an eighth note. If I wanted this to take 1/8 note to glide down, what I would do is highlight an eighth note of my grid. I need to figure out the millisecond delay value of that. How long is an eighth note at 80 BPM? What I would do is I would highlight this little bit of the grid, and I would go down into this annoying fucking yellow-orange bar telling me that I'm missing media files, which I refuse to accept. And I would put my mouse over that, and I can see when my mouse is over the highlighted area, it says duration right over here. This is what we're looking at. It'll switch over when I put my mouse there. It says duration 188 milliseconds. If I wanted my guitarist to slide his finger down at an eighth note time signature, I would set my glide to 188. And then he's going to be sliding, or she is going to be sliding in the BPM of the track. And when you unite the glide times, the delay tails, and the reverb tails to your grid this way, where everything is just matched to the BPM, you get this exceptionally mathematical and very symmetrical kind of song where everything is just like perfectly integrated. So I've been doing that a lot lately, and I didn't know that track in October 2020. It is what it is. So cool. So the music is not too exciting, just a little bit of plucking, really emphasizing those two dissonant notes, one semitone apart. After I found a section that I liked, I let delay do the work. Look at that, a delay. So exciting. Oh, is it even doing it? Yeah. So here's Echo Boy. Cool. So a little, what the heck is this one doing? Oh, there's two delays. That's what it is. Okay, cool. So a little bit of delay to kind of space out the whole pluck sound will go a lot further than if it didn't have the delay on it, obviously, as you would expect. But just by doing a little bit of delaying on the first instance here, what we're doing is we're still communicating. Let's play it in context. Cool, so this is the breakdown going into the build, but by playing just the first kind of signature pluck, like we were doing with the vocal, we found that WYLD sample, and I tried to find all sorts of ways to articulate that word WYLD by scratching it or by putting it into a spectral resonator, trying to get as much use out of this one valuable, essential resource as I could. The same is true with the delay on this pluck. I found the thing that made the pluck, which is that ding ding ding. That is the signature aspect of the pluck, this right here. That's the thing. That's what people are going to associate with the track. And in order to get more prosody to that bang ding ding, I basically just repeated that part and let delay do the rest of the talking for me. So that way all you're hearing is the associated thing that we know is the essential aspect of the track, and then a little bit of a ricochet out. Drink break. I just brought the mood down. I just want to move now. I just want the mood now. I just want the groove loud. Higher octave. I just want the groove loud. Cool. So simple. Less is more. I'm leaving a lot of space for the vocals here and for the effects and for the sampled break. Is that in the outer drums? It is not in the outer drums. Let's go ahead and take a look at that sampled break, although I don't think there's anything super special about it. Pretty sure it's just a break. Cool. So anyway, sampling breaks in your builds, especially with all the lows cut out like that, it's a really great way to get this kind of like double time natural drummer energy, like feels really, really natural. And so if you cut the kick out of it, you can often layer this up and just get a lot of extra tension out of the build. Let's go ahead and check out our build in the drums without the break. Pretty basic here, pretty EDM-y. It's got that clap pattern that we all know and hate. That shit's so basic, but really, really reliable. And then with the break on top of it, we tend to get a little bit of this syncopated kind of in-betweeny positions that are being hit by the break drum. Check it out. Makes the whole thing just light up with interest. It comes to life. So sampling little quiet breaks like this with the kick cut out in the drum build of your track is a really fantastic way to get things to feel really fast-paced and energetic. And then when you're doing kick builds, I mean, we could talk drums for days, but when you're doing kick builds, kicks don't really carry a build by themselves. They usually need some kind of either higher layer or syncopated layer to work with them. So in this case, they have both. I have added this higher layer of the crash on the kick, which really just kind of gives it that basic, but now I have something I can bob my head to. And then we also have the syncopation from the claps here. Oh, decap one shot, drum that knocks, drums that knock. Don't sleep on decap, y'all. Cool, so it all works together in this straight pattern with a syncopated pattern. That's the key to doing buildups. One or two samples that are playing straight things, just on the grid, just counting. So in this case, it's the crash and it's the claps. And then two things that are playing syncopated patterns. In this case, it's the decap, don't sleep on that snare, as well as the kick, which is playing these little in-betweeny syncopated hits. So two things there. I was holding up 3 fingers. Now, I also brought up my vocal chops here, and I've turned them off. And the reason that I did this is because the build didn't have that much prosody with what the vocal was doing until I brought up the vocal here, and I could see everywhere where the vocal was hitting, and that's what I chose to match up to the different hits of the clap transients. This way, the drummer is having eye sex with the vocalist, and they're looking at each other and they're like, yo, you gonna go there? Because I'm gonna go there if you're gonna go there. And they're speaking to each other, they're communicating to each other. So let's check it out together. And now this isn't playing, but listen to it with the vocals and the clap. So it's like my drummer is playing his syncopation on the BPM, or excuse me, on the time signature and the subdivision signature of the different vocal chops. It just makes for them being closer together and more harmonious. Everyone's playing together. It's not like one kid, middle school baseball, out in the outfield, picking his fucking nose when the pitcher's about to pitch, and not paying attention to the team. I know all about that kid because I was that kid, and then I discovered music and I was like, what the hell am I doing with sports? Cool, so let's go ahead and take a look at the effects. Oh, they're not very important, but they're so important. So the effects are, like I'm saying, not very important, but so important. This track could still be a decent track without the effects, but oftentimes what draws people to EDM is all the color and all the detail and all that dazzling little ear candy that this genre has monopolized. You don't get effects, you don't get downers and laser zaps and reverses and scratches and rewind sounds in Elliott Smith's music. You don't get it in Jack Johnson's music. You don't get it in the Rolling Stones' music. Don't get me wrong, I love rock and roll and I love acoustic music, and Jack Johnson is one of my land's finest exports. That said, when things are not, when you don't have the dazzling kinds of effects in your track, the little laser zaps and all those things, it feels conspicuously absent. And so getting the effects right is really important because that is what a lot of people are drawn to in electronic music. And in some of these cases, the risers here, for instance, let's just see. Just very smeared reese, very smeared reese with a ton of OTT on it and distortion. That's why it's all fuzzy and bubbly. But I really wanted to show you just little bits of like atmosphere. I don't think I made that actually. That's not a fair thing to show. Let me show something that I've generated. Unless I did generate that? No, that's not the thing. Where's the little bit of sound that I generated? Some of the, oh goodness gracious. Oh, that might not be this track. Ruh-roh. Unless that's just not in this section of this song. Uh-oh, here's me looking like I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. Well, normally... No, these are references. Okay. Maybe scratch that idea entirely, good friends, and forgive me for taking up your time with something superfluous and unhear. Is this it? No, that's just a little bit of resampled vocal stuff. Let's check the rise with all the other lasers. I don't think I made any of this actually. Just the reese and the riser. Yeah, I definitely didn't make that scratch sound. They could do it better than I could. Laser downer I made. So without that, doesn't quite hit right. And then with it, little bit of lasers with lots of reverb and lots of OTT on them and a lot of distortion is kind of like all you need. But what I wanted to show you is I could have swore in this track, it doesn't seem like I did, I could have swore in this track that I layered up all these little bits of high-end crackle. And I find that it is really hard to make your sounds feel really full. Let's just listen to it. I know I did that. Where the fuck is that crackling? Where are you, little crackler? Little cracker, where are you hiding from me? Okay, well, anyway, if I can find it, I will, but I'm not going to spend another 15 seconds on it. Oh, here we go, here we go, here we go. Cool. So this is a little bit of crackle that I made just from really warping the audio and distorting the hell out of whatever this Leviathan glitch was. Just distorted it, reverbed it, distorted it, reverbed it, distorted it, so that it got to be this just kind of little bit of crackle. And what I will do with these little bits of energy in the high like this stuff that is so quiet but high-endy, just a little bit of crackling, is I'll put them in drops all the time. So all of a sudden the drop happens, or a breakdown, but usually the drop happens, and you get this kind of like... You can do this with white noise, and House has made very good use of white noise, but when you create your own kinds of crackles or your own kinds of noise, you can get really, really awesome, unique sounds that no one else has. This is some white noise that was reduxed. I think this is the folder. Come on. No one else on earth has that. That's something unique to me. And it's not that special, but that doesn't mean that it isn't unique. This kind of thing. So by taking distortion, reverb, and erosion and fucking with white noise in ingenious ways, you can come up with all kinds of textures and sounds that other people don't have, and then you can put them very quietly into the drop. And then the drop takes on this kind of like crackling sort of signature, this sort of signature distortion that wasn't made with distortion. It was made with another sample that's going to let you just put another sort of feather swipe of your own personality onto the music very, very regularly. It's hard to make the highs of your bass drop feel like they're like shuddering the room, where every time the bass is like doom, the whole room is like. To do that, you often need to layer up these little bits of distortion and these little bits of saturation and stuff to make it feel like it's really fuzzy and distorted and awesome. So I do that kind of thing all the time, and I particularly liked that one because there is just something impeccably rich about this crackle. That, sir, is a fine crackle. Anyway, so enough on that. I think we can probably jump over into the larger processing. I hope you guys are still engaged, or you friends are still engaged and are having a good time. Let me know if you got any questions in the chat for us. I think those are the major elements of the track. And now let's go ahead and jump into the processing in the buses, because we've looked a little bit and how I process the groups. The vocals here are very, very sparse, and whenever I do vocal processing, I will make a completely separate project for just the vocals, and I will bounce my instrumental out of the instrumental and drag it into the vocal project. This way, I can bring all of my very CPU intensive, very expensive plugins to bear on my vocal without having to deal with sidechain demands, mastering demands, or any of the stuff that's on the instrumental channel. So by having these two kinds of separate projects saved to the same, or separate folders, I should say. I shouldn't even say that. I should actually say separate ALS files. But in the same project, you can see that here is the vocals and instrumental live. If I wanted to come in here and just grab the vocals, which are in this project, I can drop this down and I can pull in any bits of vocals only that I want into my project here. So on this chain, this all Vox chain, this is where all sorts of really intense programming has been done, and there is the melodyning and the auto tuning and all that stuff. But that just gets to be a bit too heavy for one project. So by schisming those two different projects into a vocal and into an instrumental project, and then you just bounce your vocals into the instrumental project, or just bounce your instrumental into the vocal project, you can get a lot more out of your processing power in both projects and really go to town on them. So the vocals don't have a lot here except a little bit of Slate Digital's tape saturator, which is fantastic on vocals. Shout out Slate Dig. And then the virtual mix bus, which is also this Neve setting on vocals, is quite delightful. And then also this thing it tends to create this sense of gravity. It like takes the vocals and it just like pulls them into the mids and just pulls them into the low mids and just kind of like makes them grave. Let's see if we can hear that as a team together. So without it, and then with it. It's too subtle. I can't hear it without the mastering. I feel like everything's just really quiet on my end. But if I turned it up, it would blow all your ears out. So I couldn't perceive that. Perhaps you could. Tis what it is. Anyway, the effects, nothing. Completely dry. Completely dry. They're going to a reverb send. We'll cover that in a minute. But on the group, nothing. On the music group, also pretty much nothing. When I do my processing with the music, I tend to do it on the channel itself. This I wanted to be plucky, and whenever I was clipping it, it was sounding a little bit weird and distorting. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to let this be a dynamic pluck. I'm not going to clip these. That was intentional. Nowadays, I have the Melda wave shaper. Had I known about that then, I probably would have used it, but let bygones be bygones. Anyway, cool. So music doesn't seem like anything's going on. The effects isn't going on. We saw the bass processing. That's kind of cool. But the subgroup has nothing going on. So where is all the processing taking effect? This is where we get into Skrillex bussing, aka Skrillex bussing as told by Ahi in that fantastic 2019 video, Skrillex Bussing Demystified. Everyone should go and watch that. Now, in the dojo, we do things a little bit differently, and then I do things even more differently than the dojo itself, but it's all the same principle. And the principle is essentially sending all of your groups to groups for groups, or buses. A bus is like a master group. So basically when you're composing, you take an idea and you fractal it out into thousands of different tracks, hundreds of different tracks. And then in a mixdown, it's that process in reverse. You take hundreds of different tracks and you concentrate them more and more, first into groups. Then you might have 6 or 7 groups, and then you might concentrate those groups into 4 buses. And then you concentrate those 4 buses into one master. So you start as a seed, you get very, very wide and very rich with lots of different diverse ideas, and then you start to squeeze it all back into one finished plant, into one finished master here. So on these different buses, let's go ahead and see what's going on here. The first is the sub bus. I'm going to hit number 2. All my buses will now activate. I love hotkeying things. Make sure you are using your hotkeys. Use all of Ableton's features as much as you possibly can, so that way you are beyond holistic. You don't want to just use like a few ingredients in the kitchen. You want to know where everything in the kitchen is, and you want to know how to use it. And hotkeys are a fantastic tool, and if you've never tried a hotkey before or unfamiliar with them, I really recommend you start to establish a system of hotkeys. My particular system is my mastering chain. I can hit number 1. My buses, I can hit number 2, and then all my group processing, I can hit number 3. So I can turn it all off with 1, 2, 3, and then I'm running very, very lean over here. Turn that off. Very, very lean, and then with the press of 1, 2, 3, I can run really hot, and I can start to make my whole mix completely mastered just by hitting those hotkeys. I also have number 9 recorded to my record channel, so that way I can record with the press of number 9. You don't have to do what I'm doing. Just include hotkeys in your workflow, because if you're a fan of hitting Command D, copy, duplicate, split, if you're using those hotkeys regularly, you might as well add more spells to your arsenal by coming up with some custom hotkeys that you can use. Like any good World of Warcraft player knows, the faster you can hit the spells on your keyboard, the faster you're going to fuck up those druids or whatever. Sorry if I butchered that. I don't know. I haven't played WoW. But anyway, you get the point. So with the sub over here, let's turn on our processing, and the very, very first thing, oh goodness, please tell me I wasn't doing anything in here. Okay, good. Here's something that I've learned in the last year. Only ever use linear phase with your Pro Q3 on low end. If you're going to be doing low end stuff like this, cutting at 24 Hertz or dipping out that fundamental, for the love of all things phase, please do it in linear phase. I just didn't know. It's not that big of a difference, but it's enough that I can perceive these days. So I dipped a little bit of EQing here, and then I did a little bit of clipping with the aggressive style, and barely even touched it. So we're probably just getting the slightest amount of saturation from this. No attack. We're not worried at all because there's not really transients in here. So just the tiniest bit of clipping on the sub itself, and then a I don't know what that is. And then also some volume automation. So occasionally this utility will snap on, and it will give 2 decibels of volume to each of these positions here. So like in this section of the drop, the sub comes up a little bit, or in this section, whatever, it comes up just a touch. Otherwise, very little going on with the subgroup. Next, we go to the music group, the group of all things melodic that are not sub and not drums and not vocals. So we got plucks in here, we got the bass tops in here, got the effects in here. There's the top of that bass. And in here, again, a little bit of trimming. I should have, goodness gracious, I should have used linear phase. I will die full of regrets. And I'm just kind of cutting the lows out in the stereo signal, about 80 hertz. A lot of people will cut higher. Sometimes they'll cut as high as like 150, even 200 I've seen. And I think that that kind of takes away from some of the power of a bass. By letting this cut lower, like between about 80 and 90, you're going to get a little bit of a crossover between the top of the sub and the bottom of the bass that's going to help them glue together and mesh a little bit better when they're compressed, particularly if the basses are following what the sublines are doing. If your sub and your bass are completely different notes or completely different like rhythms or something, it might not sound that good to let them bleed into one another. But because I very carefully make my basses from my subs and I will like generate them through distortion and stuff like that, I know they're perfectly in phase. So I can let this rub over or this bleed through kind of carry through. And then in the music group, transparent setting on the clipping, there's me catching those transients. Haha, that's funny. But again, very light in here. I am not squeezing the shit out of this in this stage. Now let's hop to the combined signal, and this is where the sub and the music meet up. There's that sub in here. Now the very first thing is a tiny bit more tape saturation. Yeah, not even hitting the red, just a touch. Then we have this Afex Vintage Exciter, which is a high-end exciter. If you don't have this plugin, what you can do to recreate it is drag in a saturator, and just like we were doing with that isotope trash distortion trick, you can throw in an EQ, and you can cut out the shit of this layer that you don't really want. So I could just go ahead and do this kind of thing, boost a little bit of saturation, and this is effectively the same thing as the Afex Vintage Exciter, except that the Afex Vintage Exciter is not made by Ableton. Not trying to be rude to Ableton. I love Ableton. Ableton's a fantastic thing, but the saturator in Ableton leaves a lot to be desired. Whereas this Afex Vintage Exciter made by Waves is candy, just pure candy, but it's essentially doing that same thing. So no shit talking of Ableton. I love you very much. Dankeschön. Okay, cool. Now, the next thing that's happening in here is a little bit more parallel compression coming from this solid state logic bus compressor, which, as you can see, looks very suspiciously similar to our friend the glue compressor. So you don't need to get this $400 plugin either. You can go ahead and just use your glue compressor. Same attack times, same release. The only real difference is that the glue comp has the dry wet and the SSL has the analog setting, which does make a little bit more saturation. It just adds this kind of cream to the lows and the low mids in particular. So what I'm doing in here is hitting about 4 dB of gain reduction, not even. Little bit of gain reduction across the mids, or excuse me, across the sub and the music, and very slow attack, very slow release, which is going to give us this gentle kind of massaging, slowly coming down, slowly letting off. It's not quick attacks and slow releases, and it's not quick attack and quick release. It's just slowly kind of massaging all the music together. And again, about 3.5, 4 dB is this baby's sweet spot. I listened to the dry signal on its own. We'll do it again. Listen to it on its own. And I slowly brought up the compressed signal until I heard it engage. Kind of like right there is where it really thickened up the sound, but doesn't start to sound blown out. I think I had a, what is it, minus 14 point fizzle. Sweet. So this kind of lots of little bits of parallel compression are going to make for an exponential additive effect. If you just try and have one compressor squeeze everything one time, it's going to work its ass off and it's not going to sound that good. Whereas if you have lots of little compressors doing little bits at a time, you're going to get a much larger gain at the end of the process, because it's like 1% plus 1% is exponentially increasing to 4%. It's not 1% to 1% equals 2%. It's an exponential growth curve every time you're doing little steps like this. Thereafter, we're following this process with the Melda Wave Shaper. Maybe I did know about this at the time. Why didn't I clip those peaks? Who knows what your past self was doing? How do you justify what your past behavior was? Goodness gracious, I was the worst 18-year-old on earth. I hate that person. Anyway, be kind to your past selves too, but be kinder to your future selves, because we're going to be our future selves and we never have to be our past selves again. So eat healthy, don't be an asshole, treat the people that you love with love, and you will be a much better old person for all of that. Anyway, little tiny bit of saturation here and just the highs, 1 decibel. If you don't know what this Melda Wave Shaper plugin is, you need to go and check that out right now. Stop this video and go get the Melda Wave Shaper. It's completely free and is fantastic. Cool. Then we have a little bit of EQing. Nothing's on here. Thank the Lords. Goodness gracious. Yeah, there's no such thing as Lords, but thank the goodness and graciousnesses of all the universe. Cool. So then a little bit more clipping in here with the transparent setting. You can see we've still got dynamics. That's a big dynamics. It's not this. It's not just this. No dynamics. Oh no. No, we have dynamics in here. I like to preserve a little bit of dynamism. And then finally we get to the sidechain. There hasn't been sidechaining this entire project until this combined stage. And here is where I do my sidechaining in a multi-band split. Above this, above 700 Hertz has been soloed. The amount is turned off, so there's no compression. And this above 700 cutoff point is completely transparent. So this signal isn't being sidechained. So we're not getting those weird holes in the music when the kick and the snare hit. But the lows, the part where the body of sounds are, things below about 800 Hertz, all of this is being sidechained. And if we take a look on our resampling channel, we're going to be able to see those holes appearing. Every time a kick and a snare is playing, that's where it's going to sit. So basically, the stuff the kick and the snare interfere with is being sidechained below about 800, 700 in this case. With the gatekeeper, this is my preferred sidechain mode because you can really get in there, and it's also predictive as opposed to reactive. The Ableton compressor is always going to have a little click because it has to get triggered and then it reacts, and it takes a millisecond to react. Gatekeeper, so I'm told, is actually anticipatory. It waits for the kick to come and it anticipates it and it dips the fuck out of the way when it comes. Pretty cool. So, and then thereafter, on this music group, I have another multi-band dynamic sidechain compressor. This one is tied to the vocals. So every time the vocals play, this mid signal between 2,500 and 5,000 Hertz dips down for the vocals. So the vocals are able to cut through all these big, bright basses in that very critical range from 2,500 to 5,000 that we call the pain zone. This is where human hearing is exceptionally acute, and by dipping it down out of the way so the vocal can sit forward just a bit, it lets our focus in this very important frequency range go to the vocal. So it helps the vocal kind of sit ahead of the rest of the music. Let's go ahead and see if we can hear for that. Let's find a section. Where's a section with both voice and bass playing? Here, right here. Let's do this. Okay, cool. So without this effect, let's go ahead and turn that off. So without this, you can hear the vocal pretty well. It's not like buried by any means. But then with this effect, let's try it. Holy shit. Okay, one more time. Before. After. It's leaning forward. It's leaning forward compared to the basses, and it's really like in front of them. So in here, I think it's basically, let's see, like 4 dB of gain reduction maybe? Yeah, 4.5, 5 decibels of gain reduction. Very, very slight, especially with this 4:1 compression ratio. Not too intense at all, but it really makes a big difference. Cool. Now the final bus, before it goes to the master chain, here's the mastering. We're not going to cover mastering today. I've made lots of videos about mastering, so please go and check out the other Get Quick, Get Sick videos on mastering, and you can see the whole process from start to finish with everything I know about mastering. But we're just going to kind of wrap up with the final instrumental chain, the master before the master on the instrumental group. This is all the instrumental aspects that are not vocals. No vocals in here. And so in here we have a little bit more saturation, a little bit more of this virtual mix bus, which has got that kind of gravitational pull towards the low mids and the mids that I really like in my music. A little bit more wave shaping also just in the highs. Let's see if we can perceive that before. You're going to really hear it in the hi-hat transients. So before, after. You know what, let's just stay at this section of the song. Sorry, friends. Here we go, one more time. Before. After. It's taking our music and it's doing this. It's just kind of lifting up the highs of the basses, of the white noise, of the transient response. It's just kind of like, bop, and it really helps things cut through the dark night of your track a little bit more. Thereafter, I am not going into a limiter. I used to, many years ago, limit my drums pretty aggressively, and I swear it makes for quieter masters. So I no longer limit the drums at this stage of the bus compression. I will limit them in their composition. When I'm creating the drums from scratch, I will limit the shit out of them, but not anymore on the actual master channel. And then this was a demo from a student, so don't even worry about that. So that's essentially it. The final piece of this puzzle is what's called ambience. Ambience is this stage that I would do after all this, after all the bussing, after all the group processing. And ambience is about creating almost an audible illusion of space behind the rest of the track, to help the listener understand intuitively that this was all recorded in one music studio, which of course it wasn't, right? This was recorded in a computer. So how do we create this illusion that it's in the same space? Well, the very first thing is lots of layers of saturation, which create a similitude across the entire tone of the music. You're gluing things together, you're saturating things together, you're compressing things together, and that's going to make everything feel like your feather brush or your fingerprint has been on it. Now, the other piece of this is creating 3 sends, each with a different reverb on it, of varying length. A short reverb, a medium reverb, and a long reverb. And if all 3 of these reverbs are tied to the same mathematical ratio, say 1:3, then our brain intuitively understands them as the same space. So say my short reverb is 1 second. If my medium reverb is 3 seconds, then my long reverb would be 9 seconds. And because they're within this ratio of one another, the human brain intuitively understands, oh, hey, that's just a big stadium, or oh, hey, that's a big cave, or that's a cathedral, or that is a catacomb. And your brain is able to understand intuitively that this is just one reverbed space. So let's go ahead and activate that. That is R for this, and what we can see in here is they've all been pulled down in volume. And I have driven in different frequencies, or different groups, not frequencies. I drove the drums into the short reverb, and this short reverb is a nice little plate reverb. Technically not a plate, never mind, I take it back. A real plate is completely mono, but clearly this is not a real plate. It's got a little bit of this Studio B preset on it. I've shaped the EQing just a little bit, and I took out a lot of the kicks fundamentals. So without the reverb, oh, we're at 73, yikes, yikes, yikes. Okay, 44, there we go, cool. Cool, so without the reverb, it sounds like this. And then with the reverb, it sounds like this. Practically no change, I hear you say. And that's exactly the point of this trick, is it's supposed to be the illusion of space. It's not supposed to be like, oh, hey, there's reverbs on that drums. And if you can hear reverb on the drums, you're doing it too much. Really, what I will do is I will pull this all the way down. Or first, let's get it just to 50-50. So that would be 50-50, right? 50% dry, 50% wet, 100%, 100%, 50-50. So check it out. Just sounds like, here, let's make it up. Just sounds really reverby. It just sounds entirely kind of washed out, and the kick is like not that good sounding and stuff. It sounds kind of junk. Oh, whoops, I'm on the wrong one anyway. There it is. There it is. Cool. Let's make that up. No wonder it didn't go up as well. I was like, am I imagining things? And of course I was. Here we go. It sounds really reverbed compared to this. And so it's entirely too much. So by dipping it down in volume, or what I will do is I will start with it all the way low in volume like this and slowly bring it up as I'm listening to my dry signal until I hear this bed of reverb kind of fill in the space between the transients of my drums ever so subtly. It'll round off the places where the drums are cut hard. It'll add delicate little tails, and it will add this delicate little polish and little shimmer to all the drum sounds so that we understand that their reflections are bouncing off of the walls and coming back to a microphone. So there's a lot of ways of doing this. I've seen some people use the Ableton Reverb just like this, and there is nothing wrong with this sound. This is a fantastic sound, actually. When you use the Ableton Reverb, make it 100% wet on your drums, and then you group it, because we want to do this in parallel. Always, always, always use parallel. Open up the chain, duplicate the friend down. So here's our dry signal. Oh, whoops, I shouldn't have duplicated it. Let's just create a new chain. So dry signal, reverb signal. I'm going to make it the smallest size and the smallest decay time. And boom, that is before, after, before, after. It sounds like we have an overhead. It sounds like we have microphones above the drums recording the reflections of the room. It's like an overhead mic. Very, very tasteful kind of effect. And now if I really cared, I could come in and cut the kick out a little bit with an EQ, just so it's not super muddy. We don't need the mud of the reflection in there. So usually like a low pass at like 130 will solve that. So that kind of thing, very, very useful. Some people cut the highs out so that way you don't get a bunch of sibilance and snake jazz. Sounds really, really annoying. So some people will cut it like 10K or 7K or something like that. So these little overhead racks are the same idea as what I'm doing with the ambience here, except that I use sends and I use it for all the elements of my track to give them all this similar sense of illusion. So drums are going into the short reverb with the basses. Let's listen to that channel, and I think we had set that to -4 or whatever. So subtle, so freaking subtle, it's ridiculous. If we turn on our mastering chain, that's what it sounds like in the master. So that's what we're adding to it in the master. In the medium signal, it is vocals and the music stuff, plucks and stuff like that. Together, it sounds like this. So this is what I call the shadow mix. This shadow mix is just reverb, and we start with it very quiet, and we listen to it, and we bring it up slowly in parallel with our dry signal until we get this kind of like softened reverbed bed of ambience sitting between the dry signal's transients, and you get this final thing. So let's turn off the reverb, no reverb. Sounds good, doesn't sound bad. And then listen to it with the reverb. Reverb on. Ever so slightly more spacious and dimensional. And so that's the really great thing about this trick. Now, the long reverb I use incredibly sparingly in case there is a long sweep like that I want to go on forever. I'll throw that into my long reverb, or maybe I would do it with like a snare sound, so it's like it sounds like you're falling back into space or whatever. So I use the long one very sparingly, because if you're putting basses in here, they can get really smeary, and you can see I've cut out the lows. We don't need a bunch of low mids in this bass one. But it is a nice effect to have on hand. And now, getting back to that idea of the mathematical ratio, let's see what I actually used. In this case, I used 0.7 milliseconds here, so very, very short. It can be anything. It's arbitrary at first, but if you remember from our very beginning section of the demonstration today, it's nice to grab reverb tails that are in the BPM of your track. So 0.75 is... Oh, shit, I didn't do it at the time. I guess I didn't know about that then. Anyway, I would probably nowadays grab something that is this long, which is 0.47 milliseconds, or maybe this long, 0.94 milliseconds. And this way, the reverb tails are declining at the BPM of the track, tied to the grid's BPM. Now, my medium reverb here is 3 times as long, it looks like. And then the long one is probably 3 times longer than that. Oh no, it's just 2. It's just a ratio of 2. I can't do math, that's why I became a producer. Well, that's it, folks. Let me know if you have any questions in the chat, and thanks for stopping by. WYLD drops on all major streaming platforms December 3rd, 2021. And to fully fill out that cheese meter, let's get wild. Thank you all so much. I'm Cryptochronica, and this has been a pleasure.